Hi, good morning from our New York office. My name is Gad Lebanon, and I'm leading our Labor Market Institute here at the Conference Board. Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. It is my pleasure to host this webcast on a special webcast of the Conference Board on our global labor market outlook. As you can imagine, when we did most of the work on this outlook, coronavirus was just something that happened in China, and now it's everywhere. So the outlook is changing every day now. So of course we adjusted some of our outlook, and we're going to talk about coronavirus as well. Just as a reminder, you can type questions or comments during the presentation, and we will take them as they come. I will introduce also my co-speakers on this webcast in just a minute. So let's move to the next slide, just a second. Some of the topics that we'll discuss beyond coronavirus or COVID-19 we will focus on labor market trends in mature economies. Until recently, labor markets significantly tightened for several years, and it is quite difficult now to hire and retain workers in many mature economies. There is an obvious question as a result: are working workers in emerging markets a potential solution for multinationals who are struggling in mature economies? One of the reasons for the tightening labor market is that we cannot get much more out of our existing workers, hence the slowing productivity growth. And it's also one of the reasons why there is, in many countries, a decline in cost competitiveness, because we, in mature economies, especially in the US, in manufacturing, labor productivity essentially stopped growing in recent years. In the US, the tightening of the labor market and labor shortages are much more visible among blue-collar and manual services workers. We just came out with a large report on that, focusing on the US, that we have a link to in one of the later slides. And we're also going to talk about a little about some of the main reforms, labor market reforms across mature economies later on. But let me first introduce my colleagues on this webcast. So first, Elizabeth Crowfoot, a senior economist at the Conference Board. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Hi, Gad. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, our pleasure. And next to Elizabeth on the screen is Frank Stiemers, who it says there that he's an associate economist, but he was just promoted to economist. So this is no longer accurate. And congratulations, Frank, and welcome to our webcast.
Thank you, Gad.
Thank you. And from our Brussels office, Klaas de Vrie, an economist, and who also wrote with us. I should have mentioned that in addition to this webcast, there is soon going to be a report about our global labor market outlook. So, Klaas, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Gad. Happy to be here.
Great. So, so let's start. But before we gonna tell you what we think, I want to hear what you think. So let's bring up the first audience poll question. So the question is: what do you think the impact of the novel coronavirus will be on the global economy? So there are two options. We made it simple for you. a temporary disruption, a full-fledged recession. So I'll let you chew on it for a little bit more. Again, is it just a temporary disruption or is it a full-fledged recession? I'll give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's close the survey. Okay, so 2/3 of you think that it's a temporary disruption. About 1/3 thinks that it's a full-fledged recession. Any comments from my colleagues? Are you surprised by those results? Is that what you are thinking?
Yeah, just to chime in really quick, I think it's, so much uncertainty right now about what's going to happen, how, deep this impact might be that, we're all hopeful that it will be a temporary disruption. So I think until we have more information, it's difficult to say if we will go into a full-fledged recession.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. Anyone else? Frank, Klaas?
Yeah, no, I think that's also, we'll talk more about it, of course, in the webcast, but I think this is also our view. But yeah, I totally agree with Elizabeth. I mean, it's if there's one thing for sure, we know that there's a lot of uncertainty yet about how this will play out. So indeed, let's hope for a temporary disruption.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move to our second polling question. This one is longer. How has recruitment and hiring at your organization changed as a result of the coronavirus? And you can select all that applies. You don't just need to select one option. So, and the options are no changes, increased telework, reduced hour work, reduced hiring, offering unpaid leave, layoffs, and other. And you can specify in the chat box about other. So again, recruitment, the impact on recruitment and hiring. I'll give you a few more seconds because there are a lot of options here to consider. Okay, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm closing. Okay, so let's see. So about 1/3 of you said no changes, so business as usual. 60% are allowing for increased telework. 6% are reducing hours worked. 18% are reducing hiring, so they're hiring less. Only 3% are offering unpaid leave, and 0, I think that's probably the main result here, 0% are actually started laying off people. Any reactions from the panel?
So Gert, maybe I can start reacting. So
sure.
If we think about, so it's good to see that there are no layoffs yet, or that that our viewers have not started layoffs yet, and that is also something that we expected. That first things you can do is teleworking. I'd maybe expected to see some choose, or some more people choose reduced hours work. But overall, this is very interesting, and especially the teleworking, and that more people are doing more stuff virtually, which is of course now also possible in this technological age.
Yeah. Any Elizabeth, Klaas, any reactions?
Yeah, judging by the comments from the text box, there are actually more people working from home or doing more with virtual work. So yeah, I think that's the main finding so far. On the other hand, yeah, I think this is still, I mean, this is just developing. So I don't know how this poll looks like in 4 months' time, but yeah, so far so good, looks like.
And again, just to chime in as well, we see that remote work possibilities mostly for white collar employees, but when we will see some of the impacts of the coronavirus on some of the manual services workers or in very public areas, we might start to see that reduction in hours worked as the the epidemic sort of deepens within certain regions in the U.S.
Yeah. I should say that since probably the large majority of our audience is from the US, if we would isolate the European respondents, probably the results would be a little more negative, I presume. So I think, I'll relate to the results of the poll when we look at the next slide, which is kind of telling you what we think. So there is certainly a strong impact on the global economy and on and perhaps a little less on labor market. And we think we kind of divide the way we view the coronavirus impact into two scenarios, which depends a lot on how fast this will be over. In a positive scenario, we think that the spread of COVID will significantly slow down in May, June. It's very hard to tell whether that is indeed what's going to happen. It depends partly on the containment efforts of different countries, but perhaps even more importantly, it depends on how susceptible the virus is to seasonality. So as you all know, for example, the flu, which is a distant cousin of COVID, typically dies down during May and June. It is hard to know if this is what's going to happen to COVID. There is, if you looking for some optimism, there has been a paper recently that came out that showed that the spread of coronavirus is more in a certain range of geographies that has similar temperatures and humidity, and it is spreading. So it's spreading a lot in Europe, China, Japan, Korea, Iran. But for example, it is spreading much less in countries that are south of China, closer to the equator, warmer and more humid countries, and it's so far spreading also more slowly in the southern hemisphere, where it is now summer. So if you really want something to cling to, the hope is that as the northern hemisphere moves into the late spring and summer and temperature become more humid and warm, that perhaps there will be some slowing. This is our positive scenario. And in such a positive scenario, even in the positive scenario, some countries in Asia and Europe will experience a temporary contraction in economic activity. The US will probably suffer less because we are further behind in the spreading. But even in the US, we may see a contraction in the second quarter. The impact, if this is in this positive scenario, the impact will be mostly on a drop in hours worked and reduced hiring, but without a major layoffs. And it seems that this is what you are telling us so far. But we should not rule out the more negative scenario. The markets certainly don't ignore it, and if you look at stock prices, it does seem that the markets at least price in a full-fledged recession, I would say. And in the more negative scenario, the COVID-19 continues to spread beyond the months of May, and as a result, the behavior of consumers and businesses is going to remain low for a longer period of time. In such a scenario, we will have a full-fledged global recession and major layoffs. And regardless if it's a positive scenario or a negative scenario, we'll probably see much slower employment growth in 2020. In some countries, we may even see a drop in employment, and labor markets will become less tight. But whether it's a major drop in employment or just a slowing in employment growth depends on the weather to a large degree. And I think that the good news is probably in a month's time we will know much more about how susceptible this virus is to the warming weather. So let's talk about other topics that we are going to discuss today. So first, one of the main features in the global economy, especially in mature economies, is the aging, the significant slowing of working age population and employment. And as a result, labor markets are tight, and even in the positive scenario, even they will not tighten further, but they will still remain tight. Wages are rising and squeezing corporate profits. And in particular, there may be a global warning shot from Central and Eastern Europe, where there the labor markets are the tightest in the world. It seems that they are more than any other region are bumping into supply constraints. Employment almost stopped growing at all in Central and Eastern Europe. Wages are going through the roof. And also this is the only area in the world probably that we are seeing an acceleration in inflation. So inflation was just 1% a couple of years ago and in Central and Eastern Europe, and now it's escalating very rapidly, core inflation almost growing at 3% and moving upwards. In a situation of tight labor markets, raising labor productivity, getting more out of your existing workers so you don't need to hire new ones is an obvious solution, but this is easier said than done. Really outside of Central and Eastern Europe, and maybe if you squint enough, you see some improvement in the US. Otherwise, it's very hard to see any improvement in labor productivity in recent years. In the US, perhaps the biggest weakness in terms of labor productivity is in the manufacturing sector. There it is essentially zero in this decade, which is unheard of, and that reduces the competitiveness of US manufacturing. Putting the COVID aside, the overall trends in mature economies, the demographic trends, are pointing to a shortage through 2030. All mature economies will see a significant slowing in their working age population. In many of them, it's actually going to shrink. Even in the US, it's barely growing at all. And as long as the baby boomers continue to retire, and that will certainly happen through 2030, we are going to see more of that. One thing that we're going to discuss is since it's more difficult to recruit in mature economies, are emerging markets a solution? There are a lot of potential workers there, but skill gaps and other issues are keeping some multinationals away from those countries. The 2019 was a very weak year for emerging markets. China slowed down, Latin America was growing very slowly. Russia, Turkey, there were a lot of, India was also slowing down. So So it doesn't seem like labor markets became tighter in 2019, but at the same time, a lot of the reasons for those slowings were things related to political instability and other governance issues that may deter multinationals from moving there. One kind of in a summary way to show you what CEOs and what companies are thinking about the major risk and especially the tight labor market. From our CEO Challenge survey, we asked about the external hot button issues, and what you see in this table is the ranking of different options, and highlighted is a tight labor market that is overall ranked 5, but in Japan, for example, where working age population is shrinking rapidly, it's already number 1. In the US, it is ranked number 3. In Europe, where it is less tight than in US and Japan, it is ranked 6, except for the Central and Eastern Europe, where we have a limited number of observations, but those who did reply suggest that it is a major issue there. But in Latin America and China, for example, it is not one of the top concerns. HR executive CHROs are more likely to rank this higher than some of the other C-suite members. So that's kind of the overview. Let's move to our economic outlook, which was made before coronavirus attacked us. So Klas, do you want to kind of tell us where we were a month ago and what is likely to change in this forecast?
Sure. Yeah, so on February we did do an interim update. We were scheduled to do one only in April, but given that then at that point there was already the coronavirus was hitting China, and was a lot of requests to make changes already. So that is what you see here actually is what we did in February, when we still had a relatively positive scenario that it would be contained in China, and by the end of February it would have been completely contained in China, and that is of course now playing out very differently. So as we've been already saying, I mean, this is very much in flux. So we did lower our US forecast already down to 1.6. You don't see that on this chart yet. Also for China, where by the way we're using alternative estimates, but for China we're looking for 2.2 for this year, and but it's likely that most of the global economy, but especially Asia and Europe, will see more downgrades as we come out with new numbers in the coming 1 or 2 weeks, I think. So yeah, I think it's so as you mentioned, Gert, so far it looks like that it's mostly a temporary hit. First of all, to consumption. China already was the first, of course, so that probably has the biggest hit in Q1. But for the other countries, the disruption will be visible in the Q2 numbers. So we think that it is likely that when consumers when the quarantine measures will be lifted, consumption can come back pretty quickly, which will of course help overall GDP growth. Now, of course, the supply chain disruptions, that will take a little bit longer to clear out. For example, between Europe and China, it takes about 5 to 6 weeks for ships to arrive. So there's likely going to be a lag there, and also it differs by sector. Some sectors, like IT sector, which is heavily fragmented globally, I mean, those kind of sectors will of course see disruptions throughout the year, I think. So But yeah, again, as you mentioned, I mean, it all depends on the spread. So we're going to have to monitor this in the coming weeks, and as the data comes in, see how things develop.
Thank you, Klaas, and let's remain optimistic. Frank, what are the trends in employment that we've seen prior to COVID?
Right. So let me give some extra details some details on what you already told the audience in the introduction. So just in the next couple of slides, this is indeed an employment chart, but we're going to talk about working age population, labor force participation, unemployment rates, because that basically can show you how tight the labor market is and what is happening on the supply side. So let me start with this first chart. What we're looking at is employment growth. We have it here for Japan, US, and 3 regions in Europe. So that is Northern and Western Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe. And what you can see is that since 2018, employment has started to slow down across all these mature economies. In the US, it's actually still holding up pretty strong. So especially over the last 3 months was actually a small acceleration in employment growth. But as we were just talking about, as we expect slower demand growth, slower economic growth over the next, at least over the next couple of months, we do expect also that employment will further slow down. Here you can see also the blue line, which I want to point out. Gert already mentioned it. Central and Eastern Europe probably has the tightest labor markets in the world, and you will often see them standing out in every chart. So here, at this point, employment is barely growing. So that is what is happening to employment growth. Having talked about economic growth, what is often one of the most important insights from our institute is that businesses should be paying attention to what is happening to the most important supply indicator, and that is the working age population. So we know we have always had the working age population that was growing, so more people entering this working age population and fewer people exiting. But now we have the large baby boomer cohort that has started to retire. So you can see that across mature economies, there are already many where working age populations actually already have started to shrink, and this is only going to accelerate over the next decade. So let me go into the chart and explain exactly what we're looking at. So we're looking here at the working age population growth over the last 2 years. So at the top of the chart, you see some regions. You see some emerging markets and developing countries where working age population growth is still very strong. And in a minute, Elizabeth is going to give some more information to these regions. First, I want to focus a little bit more on mature economies. So you see there are some exceptions. If we go a little bit down, you see Australia, you see Canada, but also the US, where population or working age populations are still growing. But especially in Japan and Central and Eastern Europe, it has already started to decline. And this is, of course, putting a lot of pressure on the available supply of labor, which makes recruitment more difficult.
Frank, is if I may ask a question, the positive mature or the matured economies with the positive growth numbers, is that because of immigration, or is that just because they have more favorable?
I think that's a very good point. It's immigration is also an important point. We know in the US you have more immigrants, the same as in Australia and in Canada, so that is giving an extra boost to it. But across all these economies, we see more or less similar shares of baby boomers retiring, and the new young people that are entering this working age population are more or less the same size or a little bit smaller.
Yeah, and just to chime in about the emerging markets, then it seems that, in emerging markets, we're really seeing the opposite trend that we've seen in mature economies, where the working age population is accelerating very rapidly, especially in regions like Africa, the Gulf region, and other Middle Eastern countries, Latin America, and developing Asia, for example. And for these regions, we're really seeing a lot more entrants into the labor force or the working age population than exits, because these are very young, populous regions. So it's an opportunity for employers to capitalize on this favorable age composition by really investing in training and technologies that are going to enhance the available workforce. So this is really a window of opportunity that we're going to see coming up. But there are some differences. If I can point out Thailand and China at the bottom of the graph, China especially has already started to see a decline or a contraction in their working age population. So we see increases in labor shortages there. And Thailand also is on the verge of having a contraction in their labor supply. And by the end of the decade, they're going to be in negative territory as well. So it's for now, there's, these emerging markets really have a more abundant labor supply that employers can take advantage of.
Elizabeth, there's a question about Central America. Is that included in this chart under Latin America, or can you highlight that?
Actually, maybe Frank can answer that question more directly, whether those particular countries are included in this chart.
Yeah, we included some of these countries that were available in the Latin American aggregate, and we see that most of these countries have similar growth rates in their population. So if that answers the question. So back to you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, and go ahead, Gad.
No.
I wanted to, I'm going to move to the next slide because I wanted to talk about some of the implications about the growth in the labor supply in emerging markets in terms of being able to provide employers with an alternative in terms of recruiting from other areas that have labor markets that are much less tight and even very loose compared to some of the mature economies that Frank has been talking about. So to start with China, a lot of multinationals have relied heavily on China as an outsourcing destination, but we've talked about the labor shortages that are increasing and imminent, the recent increases in tariffs, political instability in Hong Kong. All of these have really been pushing companies to move their supply chains outside of China. And now the coronavirus has just accelerated that trend. So we do hear examples, for example, of Google and Amazon recently announced that they're moving some of their production of their devices to Vietnam and Thailand. And also there are some nimble apparel companies that can move production to countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan. But these other Southeast Asian countries are still very heavily integrated in the Chinese supply chains. So multinationals need to look to other regions as well in order to diversify their production, reduce the risk of being completely dependent on one country or one region for their production processes. So other regions to look to, for example, Latin America, here labor markets are relatively loose. Unfortunately, that's because they have had very disappointing economic growth in recent years. For example, Brazil had a major recession in 2015 and 2016. That the country is still, it's growing now and is coming out of that, but it definitely impacted those labor markets. And Latin America is particularly compromised, or their labor markets are compromised by low technological intensity, so a lower rate of innovation and lower ability to absorb new advances that come from mature economies, and also political instability. Countries like Peru, Chile, Argentina, Venezuela, they've all had instances of contentious government elections, corruption, widespread protests that are really undermining those labor markets. So moving to sub-Saharan Africa, now this is the world's fastest growing urban workforce. We saw that some of their working age population projections, or currently their working age population is increasing very rapidly. So they are increasingly a viable low-cost outsourcing destination. And there are many opportunities in various industries, including manufacturing, but they have largely sidestepped that whole industrialization process. And instead, they're going straight into opportunities for business process outsourcing and IT outsourcing. There's growing ICT services sectors in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And companies like Microsoft and Amazon have opened or are soon opening this year new data processing and cloud computing centers in these countries. That's really, continuing that narrative and those opportunities for business outsourcing in these countries. And then moving to the Gulf region, This is a very unique area in terms of labor markets. It's largely dependent on oil revenues, and increasingly governments are investing in the private sector, but for the most part, their very young population prefers to work in these cushy public sector jobs that have higher salaries, good benefits, job security. So for multinationals operating in this region, it's really as if they were in a much tighter labor market because they have to compete with the public sector for all of these workers. And in general, labor markets in emerging markets do suffer from lower labor quality. They do have weaker educational systems and skill gaps. But this is to differing degrees across the different regions. And we do have another slide that will dive a little bit deeper into this labor quality issue, so I'll save my comments for that discussion in a couple of minutes. But I can throw it back to the next slide. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So, Frank, let's talk a little more about the details of the tightening labor markets and the reasons behind that.
Yeah, sure. So let me start with the often the first indicator what we are looking at when we think about labor market tightness, and that is the unemployment rate. So what we're looking at this chart is for the Euro area, the United States, and Japan, the unemployment rate, how it has been trending downward this decade. We now see that over the last 2 years it has started to flatten, and this also means that we believe that probably unemployment rates at this point, as we were already talking about, with slower demand, slowing supply side growth, that probably labor markets will remain tight, but will maybe not further tighten during 2020. What this means for different countries, I can talk about in the next slide, because of course within regions there are still a lot of differences. So let me first explain exactly what we're looking at here, because it is a little so let me just explain what we're looking at here. We are comparing here the current unemployment rates with the unemployment rate before the Great Recession. And we compare it to that period because that was a relatively normal time for labor markets. So to give an example, if we look at Germany, we see it as 6.2. So 6.2 means that currently the unemployment rate is 6.2% lower than it was before the Great Recession. And this can be a first indication of how tight labor markets are in these countries. So at the top of the list, you see, as said, Germany and many countries from Central and Eastern Europe, where labor markets are especially tight. The United States, we have more or less in the middle of the pack. The unemployment rate is not definitely lower than it was before the Great Recession. Other countries I want to point out are at the bottom of the list. There you see Italy, Spain, also Greece. They've made a lot of improvements, and also unemployment rates have been declining over the last few years. But still, labor markets remain relatively loose in these countries. So I think that gives like the first overview of like how tight labor markets are. Maybe let me also add that like in some Southern Eastern European countries, there are also more people that are working, but for example in part-time jobs, and they would actually like to work in full-time jobs. So the unemployment rate does not capture everything. It gives the first indication how tight labor markets are, but in some countries there's maybe room for even tighter labor markets, or for unemployment rates to decline a little bit further. So what could provide, of course, with tight labor markets some relief is if more people start participating in the labor market. So that is what we often talk about with labor force participation rates, that are basically the people in the population that are either working or actively looking for work. So where we have seen a lot of improvements over the last years is in female participation. That is what we're not showing in this chart, but where we have also seen a lot of improvements, or a lot of strong increasing trends across mature economies, is for mature workers. What we're showing here is the labor force participation rates for those aged 55 to 64, and you see that especially in Japan, that's the light gray line, especially since 2013, there's been a strong increase, because especially they are feeling that the declining supply of people in the working age population is forcing them to get more people to participate in the labor market. You see similar increasing trends in Europe. Here I want to focus a little bit on the US. In 2000, it was still much higher than most European countries. Now we actually see that most countries in Northern and Western Europe have actually higher participation rates for mature workers. So here maybe I ask Elizabeth to talk a little bit more about why this labor force participation rate in the United States has been relatively flat over time.
Yes, it's definitely an area where employers are not as willing to, tap into this particular demographic. We just published a report in January on some of the challenges and solutions to labor shortages in the U.S. And in that report, we looked into some of the reasons why this is happening. And for example, we conducted a survey, and one of the potential solutions for labor shortages was providing new incentives to retain older workers in full or partial capacity. And this was one of our least popular retention solutions. So U.S. employers generally have really high concerns about older workers associated with lower productivity, having them limit the promotion opportunities of younger workers, or also they're more expensive to have on payrolls because of higher wages and salaries associated with them, and also healthcare costs are higher. So, what we argue in our report is that this is really a short-sightedness of employers, that U.S. companies can really do more to attract older workers, such as offer flexible schedules and accommodate some of the physical needs to make work easier for older workers. So it's an area of improvement that U.S. employers can look to increase labor force participation and just get more workers into the door.
Elizabeth, is policy also a big issue here? For example, I think what we saw in the working age population chart was that the United States still had some or more favorable working age population growth, and especially in Europe and Japan, there's a big decrease already in working age population growth. So you see governments that are raising the retirement ages, and that is basically also forcing them to work longer. Is that also a major part here, or?
Not as much. I mean, like you said, countries like Japan especially have implemented policies to encourage women and older workers to stay in the labor force, but that's not something, at least that I know of, that the U.S. has been really focused on so far.
In the U.S., retirement age, kind of an official retirement age, is illegal, other than in a few specific jobs like air pilots and such. So there is no official retirement age. There has been over the last couple of decades changes to Social Security and pension schemes that are supporting a higher retirement age, but it's not an official policy.
There's also a question here, I guess, Elizabeth, regarding your point that U.S. employees are not tapping into the mature workers pool. So Kathleen asks whether this is a cultural thing, and whether U.S. employers could be convinced to change this policy.
I think it's more of a company by company or industry by industry basis. We did do follow-up interviews with many of our respondents, and in manufacturing especially, they said they already have a very large pool of older workers, that they're not retiring as fast as they would actually like them to. And so for that reason, they're not targeting more older workers. And especially in the trades, the problem is getting younger people interested in that line of work. So it's just, I think, an industry by industry challenge. And hopefully, for more white collar work, there are ways. We found that many white collar workers that want to expand their work life, their employers are not offering formal programs. Everything's done on an ad hoc basis. So just encouraging employers to formalize those retirement programs and to really, give older workers the tools they need to expand their working life is something that I think employers can be encouraged to do.
And we have another comment here from Paulette, who says that many baby boomers are working till they are older. So she's apparently 69 and she's also still working full time. And she also mentioned that, again, coming back to the policy, is that people are encouraged to retire later, because if you retire later, you can have a larger monthly income. So I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, no, I mentioned the Social Security rules did change in a way that encourage slightly later retirement. But when you look at, we expected a few years ago that as labor markets get tighter, we will see a very large increase in the share of people over 65 that are still in the labor force, and that didn't really happen. There was some increase, but it's not a game changer. I think a lot of people are not that excited about working, and they've been waiting their entire life for retirement. In other jobs, it's simply very difficult to work into your late 60s and 70s, and especially blue-collar and manual services jobs that have a physical aspect to that. So I would say overall it is happening. It is supporting the labor market, but I don't think it's a game changer. The number of people who will stay longer is a fraction of the number of baby boomers who will actually retire. Okay. Class, we also, in addition to kind of looking at the short term, we also have projections for the next decade that you are responsible for, about the overall economy and in particular about some of our labor market indicators. Do you want to talk to us a little about that?
Sure. So up to this point, I think we mainly talked about the quantity of labor, right? I mean, the labor supply, the working age population growth. But you can also broaden the perspective a little bit, and that's what we do here. So we have, on the one hand, we have the labor quantity projections, which are, as I said, I mean that's mostly working age population growth, adjusted for changes in participation rates. And then there you can also look at labor quality growth rates, and basically that, I mean, your quantity of labor or your talent pool may shrink, but the point here is that you can still get more out of your existing workers by improving, the skill set, improving the education, and that is basically what we measure here by labor quality. So it's in that sense, it's getting more out of your existing workforce. It's a labor productivity related measure. So just a little bit on how we get to these projections. So what we do here is we proxy them by educational attainment. So this is changes in basically upskilling of the workforce in terms of getting higher degrees. So it does not necessarily one-to-one translate into skills that are directly can be used in the workforce or by business. So there's not, in that sense, not a direct one-to-one link. But I think the point here is also just to to broaden the scope a little bit, and to not stare only at the labor pool, the labor supply, but broaden your perspective a little bit. So I think
Good. So we are starting to be a little short on time. So, but there are several important things that we still want to cover. So, Frank, can you talk briefly about the wage situation as a result of the tight labor market?
Yeah, of course, that's one of the indicators that employers are often most interested about, to see what has happened to wages now the labor market is tightening. So here we see wage growth, and let me just first talk about the blue line because it really stands out. Again, that is Central and Eastern Europe. Wages have been growing over 10% over the last 2 years. Employment growth, as you already saw, is also not growing anymore. And the only thing employers can now do to offer much better wages to attract workers. But let me also look a little bit at the other countries. Overall, wage growth remains relatively low, maybe compared to previous decade. We often say that you have to keep in mind that also inflation and also productivity growth have been much lower this decade. So that are two important indicators that can explain why the overall level has been lower in this decade. In Northern Western Europe, we see now more wage growth. Southern Europe and Japan, not so much yet. And in 2020, it will all depend on what will happen to our economic growth and also the supply projections. But it may remain a little bit flat for now because companies will be a little bit more uncertain. For the US, I give it back to you, Gert, to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So that's something that we've been discussing for quite a while, and a lot of it is in our report here that we just came out with. But the main story is in the US. We divided here. The red line is the wages for management professionals and related, about 40% of the economy. For the red line, for that group of people, very modest acceleration in wage growth. But for all other occupations, especially the blue collar and the manual services, we are seeing a much stronger wage growth, already well above pre-recession rates. So it's a kind of a tale of two labor markets in the US, and you can read all about it in this report. I think another very important trend that is related to wages is the impact that has on inflation. So what we see here is the growth rate in inflation, core inflation. So that's total inflation minus food and energy, which is kind of a more fundamental measure of the trends in inflation. So you see in most of those regions that we are showing here, or countries, inflation is pretty low historically and is not showing any signs of acceleration. In other, except for one region, that's Central and Eastern Europe, that we are seeing that we moved from about 1% to almost 3% increase in core inflation. And we think that this is a direct result of the economy bumping into supply constraints and the rapid growth in wages that is filtering into consumer prices. I think we have to skip a few slides, and because we want to touch on a couple of things before we finish. One of the results of the tighter labor market and the slowdown in revenue is that we are seeing a squeeze on corporate profits. Frank, do you want to briefly talk about the euro area in that context?
Yeah, so let me tell the audience what we're looking at in this chart. So we're looking at the share of compensation and the share of profits in gross value added, or in output, basically. So now the share of, or now labor costs are rising, more money or more revenues will, or more money will be going to compensation, so there was less available for profit. So if you look at the blue line here, you see that over the last 2 years, this has started to decline, while the red line has started to increase. So you can clearly see that also companies' profits are now are being squeezed because of rising labor costs. And I think it is even more visible in the US. So you can maybe talk about that, Gert, in the next slide.
It is more visible in the US, as we can see here. We clearly see an increase in the share of wages and salaries and revenues. That's the red line, and a comparable drop in the share of corporate profits. And I think in the quarters ahead, not so much because of the drop of the increase in labor costs, but because revenues will collapse especially in March and in the second quarter. So we will see corporate profits dropping very rapidly in the coming quarters. Just before finishing, a lot of the work that we did in our labor shortages report was about solutions to labor shortages, and there are a lot of information there. It's based on a survey that we did to our companies, and I can't do it justice in 1 or 2 minutes, so I'll just encourage you to go to the report and see what companies are doing to deal with the increasing labor shortages.
And for those that are interested in listening to it, we do have a podcast series as well that explains this 80-page report in 3 15-minute segments where Gad, Frank, and I discuss it. So I encourage everyone to listen to that as well.
And I think we have a link to that in a couple of slides. Let's hear one more time from the audience. Our last polling question. So which of the following solution has your organization used to address US labor shortages? Choose all that apply. So one is tactical recruitment and retention solutions, re-evaluating job requirements and relaxing hiring criteria, increasing training and developing talent pipelines, developing policies around flexibility and reducing the burden of work, expanding recruitment demographics. So and
while we wait for, let me just explain the tactical recruitment and retention. Those are things like referral programs, increasing social media, using staffing firms, using technologies to streamline recruitment, shortening the recruitment process, making managers accountable for retention, and conducting one-on-one stay interviews.
Right. So let's give you a few more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let's close it. So yeah, we see here that tactical recruitment and retention solutions, those are kind of the low-hanging fruit. They are indeed very popular, and a lot of companies are doing them. Some of the other things are less popular and only more impacted companies are doing, like relaxing hiring criteria or expanding recruitment demographics. But we have 59 solutions that we offered in our survey, so this is just the tip of the iceberg. And if you want to read more about that, it's in our report. So let's go back to the slides. Elizabeth, I'm afraid we won't have time to go through the labor market reforms, but a chapter on this is going to be in our upcoming global labor market outlook, so you can read it there. And just as Elizabeth, you mentioned earlier, we have a podcast series called Indications. There are links here, and you can see all of the, if you like to listen to podcasts in your car or in the gym or anywhere, this is a good use of your time, I may suggest. And you can hear about, we have a segment, 3 segments about our report, so you are welcome to listen to that or to anything else. I think this is the end of the webcast, just on time. I want to thank my colleagues, Klaas, Elizabeth, and Frank. Thank you very much for joining me. We know it's a difficult period right now with the coronavirus and all the implications it has. For example, I'm a big NBA fan, and they just canceled the season on me. So, but there are, of course, people who are much more affected than I am. So good luck with that for everyone. And if you have a minute to give us some evaluation on our webcast, it will help us in the future. So thank you very much and have a great rest of the day.